then it is no more works. If it is grace, it has how much to do with works?
0.
Nothing to do with works. Now, just in case that isn't understandable, otherwise, grace is no more grace. So grace ceases to be grace when what comes in? When works comes in, grace is non-existent. But if it be of works, then it is no more grace. Paul must have known these people were having hard grace. It doesn't have works. If it has works, then it's no more grace. And if it's grace, then there's no such thing as works. Otherwise, works is no longer works. Man, I tell you, I get so tickled when I read this. I mean, it's like Paul is just taking this and just, don't you get it? If works are involved, there's no such thing as grace. James, did you get it? No, he never did. Sorry, James never got it. James was absolutely convinced that it was by faith and by works that there was justification. He made it very clear. What then? Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election has obtained it, and the rest were blinded. You see, in fact, the election obtained it while they were all blinded. Everyone was blinded by the law because of this term sunkleo. This is just the way this has always gone. God didn't just pick a few to put under the law. He didn't pick a few to blind. He blinded everybody because there was a powerful work that was going on that would have nothing to do with mankind, that would set us in a position that is so unique, so powerful, that all it takes is knowing about it to revolutionize people's lives and life on planet Earth, just by knowing about it. And by knowing about it, it means there's nothing you can do about it. If there's nothing you can do about it, then it has nothing to do with your works. Else works, grace becomes something you do about it. Otherwise, something you do about it becomes no more grace. So grace becomes something that there's nothing you can do about it. Israel didn't obtain it, but they got it. They didn't obtain it, but they got it. So what is this heartfelt plea from Paul? Oh, my heart's desire and prayer to God is that Israel would be saved. Now he's explaining they didn't obtain it, but they got it. According as it is written, God hath given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear. And then he says, unto this day. Remember when he said in speaking to them in Corinthians, he said that the veil from Moses can still be over these people's eyes, to where that if they are still trusting in the law, they're not going to be able to see grace. That very same thing can be said to Christians. The law is a blinding factor. It blinds. And David said, now, remember when we started chapter 10, or the end of chapter 9, and we read, behold, I lay in Zion a stumbling block, a rock of offense, a stone of stumbling?
Yeah.
Remember we read that? So was that a little bit hard for your head to go kind of like this, because we've always been taught that Jesus was the stumbling stone and the rock of offense? Well, let's read a little bit further then. And David said, let their table be made a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a recompense unto them. Now, do you have any doubt as to what the stumbling block was? It was their laws, their feast days, the tabernacle, the temple. Everything became the very thing that God laid out became the stumbling block and the stumbling stone for them. To what degree? Let their eyes be darkened, that they may not see, and bow down their back always. I say then, have they stumbled that they should not fall, that they should fall? God forbid. Did they trip over the stumbling stone that there would be no recovery for them? No, they were supposed to trip over the stumbling stone. They were supposed to get tripped up by the law. But rather through their fall, and how did they fall? They fell how? By tripping over the law. Salvation is coming to the Gentiles. So while the Jews were still feverishly working toward becoming righteous through the law, suddenly the Gentiles come in. What a shock. Now the problem was that the Gentiles thought that they got in because of their belief. This is what Paul's going to address throughout the rest of this chapter, is the fallacy of personal faith getting you saved. Folks, we're not here to discount personal faith and a belief in your own heart. We're here to challenge, or let Paul challenge for you, what it actually does and what it actually does not do. It's vitally important to know what your beliefs can accomplish and what your beliefs cannot accomplish. Because if you think your beliefs can accomplish salvation and redemption for you, you are in a cult. You are in an antichrist cult. Because the emphasis has been taken off of Jesus and has been placed on you. It has been taken off of his obedience. It has been taken off of his righteousness. It has been taken off of his faith. And it has been placed on your faith, your righteousness, and your disobedience. What is that, Michael? To the gospel of Jesus Christ, that is cultish. But rather through the fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, they fell. Yeah. Were they utterly cut off? No, they weren't cut off. They stumbled. They fell as they were supposed to do. By them stumbling and falling over the law, it gives another understanding of the possibility that Gentiles could be included in this. Now, part of this is Peter's fault. This church was established by Peter. Let me tell you what Peter went back to this church and told them. Jesus appeared to him and let down a sheet from heaven with all manner of four-footed beasts in it, and said and told him to rise, kill, and eat. Peter said, I'm not doing it, Jesus. Again, Jesus said, Peter, rise, kill, and eat. I refuse to, Jesus Christ, Son of God, risen Savior. I refuse to obey you. The third time, Jesus says to him, Peter, rise, kill, and eat. I wish he'd have said, rise, kill, and eat before I kill you. But a gospel of peace had already been declared. Sorry, I got a little judgment left in my heart still. Peter got a revelation of the redemption of the whole world. So he goes back to these people, and you know what he says to them? I've got some incredible news. Man, I'm telling you, Jesus himself has appeared to me. And you know what he told me? He told me that even the Gentiles can be saved. Now, it seems as though Peter was a little bit ADD. Everything that Jesus ever told him, he had to tell him 3 times. It's like, wake up, Peter, did you hear what I just said? Well, let me tell you again. Peter, feed my sheep. Huh? I said feed my sheep. What do you mean? Feed my sheep. That's what I meant. Peter, hey Peter, do you love me? Well, of course I love you. Hey Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Peter, do you love me? And each time Peter responded with a different word than what Jesus asked him. Jesus was asking him if he agaped him. And he responded with words that were lower level of love. Filio. Yes, I filio you. Yes, I and one that is means brother. I have a familial love for you. No, Peter, I ask if you agape me. Every time that Jesus ever spoke to Peter, he had to tell him 3 times. And even when he told him 3 times, he still, in this case, did not get the message correct. And went back and told them something that has held the entire Christian world in bondage ever since that misinterpretation, misquoting Jesus after he said the Gentiles can be saved. Just think what would have happened if Peter would have come back with what Jesus told him. Guess what? All Gentiles have been cleansed. They're all saved. What would they have figured out about the Jews? Well, dear God, if the Gentiles got it, then we surely are in there, right? But that wasn't the message that this man, Peter, brought back. It was a possibility message. It was a can-be message. It was a can-do message, not a God-did message. Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Now, he's having to present this to them in a possibility mode because that's where they're trapped in their thinking. But watch how Paul takes this, this doctrine that Paul taught them, that the Gentiles can be saved, and the possibility of Jews being saved, and watch Paul begin to whittle that down to where that it is absolutely wood, hay, and straw. Verse 13. For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my office. Now I think that Paul was saying this because, if you go back and read the story, Jesus didn't call Paul to the Gentiles. Jesus called Paul to the Jews and to the Gentiles. Made it very clear in the book of Acts. This was a political settlement. This is how these guys were to get along. Okay, you go to the Gentiles and we'll go to the Jews. Because the last thing we can have is you running around telling Jews that they're not under the law, that they don't have to be circumcised. If you're going to tell people that bullshit, you're going to tell it to Gentiles, not to Jewish people. They called him in on the carpet 2 times for that very reason. Do you know that James came up with the solution for Paul in teaching not Jewish people but Gentiles? Do you know that he gave them 3 of 4 laws that Paul was told to have to preach? He gave them 3 laws that had nothing to do with anything except Jewish custom. Abstain from things strangled. Abstain from blood. He gave them only instructions. The only one he gave them that was any moral based was, stay away from fornication. Everything else was nothing but a Jewish custom. That's all it was. And he said, you've got to keep these. You've got to tell the Gentiles they've got to keep these Jewish customs. Why? Loss of control, that's why. They've got to keep these, you've got to tell them they've got to keep these. Now, not only did they tell him, they so did not trust Paul, they wrote all this stuff down in a letter and sent 2 men with him to stand up and read this letter about what the Gentiles had to do to be saved in all of Paul's meetings from there forward. They didn't just say, now, Paul, this is what you need to tell these folks. They said, here are 2 men that we are sending with this letter, and they are going to inform the people that you preach to that this is our decision. You think there weren't politics involved in all this? I magnify my office. If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are of my own flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciliation of the world, so even if you believed that the Jews were completely cast away, Paul said it would have meant the reconciliation of the entire world. What shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? And how do you determine righteousness according to chapter 1? Resurrection from the dead. Paul's a crafty fellow, folks. He then says, for if the first fruit be holy, the lump is holy, and if the root be holy, so are the branches. You see, they were trying to break this down as to who was in, who was out, who was holy, who wasn't holy. And Paul just said, hey, if God's holy, if Jesus is holy, the branches are holy, the root's holy, tree's holy, branches are holy. And if some of the branches be broken off, he didn't say when the branches are broken off. He said if some of the branches are broken off, and thou, being a wild tree, he's speaking to the Gentiles, were grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and the fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. And what was their boast? We have believed in our hearts and confessed with our mouths. That's what they were boasting about. Same thing Christianity boasts about to this very day. Ignoring the power of the completed work of the cross. Thou will say then. Who will say then? It's not Paul saying, thou will say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off. And you stand by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. Folks, if this is by your faith, you need to live in fear all the time. How many of you lived in that fear when it was by your faith? This is just the natural outcome of thinking that personal faith is what brings you redemption and salvation with God. For if God spared not the natural branch, take heed lest he spare not thee. Man, you see, they're saying, well, the reason we got in is because God cut off, Israel was cut off. Do you know there's no place that teaches that in the Bible? Paul is addressing a doctrine that the Gentiles had adopted to try to say, this is how we got in. We were grafted in through our own belief. And Paul is renouncing this concept of being grafted in. Because remember how Paul is taught throughout this entire book? That if you are a part of the plant, you had to be in the seed before the plant or before the seed died. And now these people are talking about getting attached after the fact. Sorry, that's not the way this worked. Getting attached after the fact is not the gospel. If God didn't spare them. So in your mind, God didn't spare the Jews. His chosen ones, his predestined ones. The ones he selected himself. The ones he gave the covenant to. The ones that, blah, 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 on and on and on. Paul goes into detail in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4 about their unbelief. Saying, yet today, if you harden not your heart. For if Christ had given them rest, then why would he say today, if you harden not your hearts? As in the provocation. Behold, therefore, the goodness and the severity of God. On them which fell, severity. But toward thee, goodness. And if you continue in his goodness, otherwise, you're going to get cut off too. Oh, happy day. Man, I'm telling you, isn't that great confidence? They believe for sure God cut off the Jews. They have no natural right to this inheritance whatsoever. Zero natural right to this inheritance. Yet God cut them off. You really don't have a lot of safe ground to stand on, Gentiles. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in. For God is able to graft them back in again. But you see, Paul is showing that they were never cut off in the first place. But let's take your mindset. God cut them off. So how are they going to get back in if they got cut off because of unbelief and you're in because of belief? God is through belief, if he did it through belief, is able to graft them back in again because of their belief. Is that what happened? Let's continue the story. For if thou were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into the good olive tree, how much more, since these, which be the natural branch, be grafted into their own olive tree. Now, this is the third thing that Paul has brought up about things that are against nature. Chapter 1, the only thing the Christian world knows is chapter 1 about things that are against nature. It's the only one they know. They don't know about chapter 2, about circumcision and uncircumcision. They don't know. They have no clue. They don't know anything about chapter 11, where he's talking about being cut off and being grafted in against the nature. For if thou were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these which be the natural branches be grafted in to their own olive tree. For I would not, brethren, that you should be or remain ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits. Now, what did Paul just describe all of this cutting off and adding on and getting the Jews that got cut off, they got grafted in, waiting on the Jews to get grafted back in through belief. It all happened through your own faith. He called it ignorance. He said there's a mystery there's a mystery you missed. Lest you should be wise in your own conceit. That blindness in part happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. That's what Jesus told Peter, right? That the Gentiles had been cleansed. Verse 26. And so all of Israel shall be saved. Now, where is he getting this from? Is he saying all of Israel is going to be saved? Remember, he expressed his great concern about Israel not being saved. And man, he'd give up his own salvation to see his own countrymen saved. And so all Israel shall be saved, as it is written. So shall be now goes back to the scriptures. And if it's a shall be in the scriptures, what is it after the cross? It's not a shall be anymore, is it? Because who fulfilled all of the scriptures? So is the shall be still a shall be? It's not a shall be anymore, not since Jesus came to fulfill all the law and the prophets. There shall come out of Zion a deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them, when I shall cut them off from the natural tree. Doesn't say anything like that, does it? What was God's covenant with Israel? When I shall take away their sin. As concerning the gospel, they're enemies for your sake. But as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sake. For the gifts and callings of God are without repentance or change of mind. Is it possible that Israel was cut off? It is not even possible. Why? Because the gifts and callings of God are without repentance. Remember how they took this verse out of context in your church? Oh man, the gift of tongues, the gift of giving. They love people with the gift of giving. The gifts, the gifts, the gifts, the gifts. And boy, once you got it, even if you start sinning, God's never going to take that gift away from you. Now, they taught that he would never take away, you could still lay hands on sick people if he gave you that gift, but the gift of salvation, take it away from you in one split second. But you, as a low-down, filthy sinner in their eyes, could still go around healing people. But don't be surprised about it, because the gifts and callings of God are without repentance. Once God has given you something, he doesn't take it back, except for salvation. The gifts and callings of God, how we use that out of context, how powerful it is, and how out of context and meaningless and neuter we made it. For as ye in times past have not believed God, yet have now obtained mercy through their unbelief. What led to mercy? Unbelief led to mercy. That's why they call it mercy, folks. Faith didn't lead to mercy. Believing didn't lead to mercy. Unbelief led to mercy. For who? How much? Paul, come on, just tell us. Is this about the Jews, about the Gentiles? Which one are you talking about? Even so have these also now not believed, that through your mercy, the mercy that you got out of their unbelief, they also may obtain mercy. For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. And then Paul can't hold it back anymore. He's been writing this, laboring over this. How do I get through to these people's minds? How do I get this to the point to where that they understand this? How do I get this to the point to where that they are not struggling with their own personal faith? How do I get this to where that they know that it's not Jewish faith, it's not Gentile faith. The Gentiles, the Jews weren't cut off. The Gentiles weren't grafted in. How do I get them to understand this? His only choice is to show them just how valuable unbelief is. For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. Paul brings this teaching to a close in such a euphoric way. I'm telling you, this is what the gospel does. When you realize that it is by unbelief that we were led into the promise of God. When you begin to realize that it is by our failure, by Israel's failure. When you realize that the stumbling stone and the rock of offense and stone of stumbling wasn't Jesus, it was the law. Jesus is not a rock of offense. Jesus is not a stumbling stone to the Jews. Paul said just a few verses later, let their table become a snare to them, and let their entire system become a stumbling stone. You see, Jesus is not a stumbling stone. Jesus is a cornerstone. Jesus is a headstone. Jesus is a keystone. The Jews, you can't stumble at a keystone. How many times Paul affirmed to them that the stumbling stone was the law, the sacrifices, their entire rituals and everything about them was a stumbling stone and a rock of offense, and that God would use these things to blind their eyes and stop their ears to the point to where they would fall flat on their faces trying to follow it. And fall they did. My favorite verses in the entire New Testament, especially of Paul's writings. And you cannot help but have this response. When you realize this magnificent gospel that is detached from personal faith, that is detached from your own obedience, detached from circumcision, detached from your own righteousness, detached from everything, that you had nothing to do with it at all. But the fact of its power still exists, and the gospel is the power of God itself. Gospel cannot redeem you, folks. It only informs you that you were redeemed. It has been one of the most foolish things that Christianity's ever done, going around saying they're sharing the gospel so people can get saved. The ones we need to be teaching it to so they can get saved is the ones who's going out trying to preach to the people they think need to get saved. Because this is a whole different animal of salvation. The people they're going to share with have already been redeemed. And let the redeemed of the Lord say so. Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments, and his ways past finding out. For who hath known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? I've met a few of them. You ever met some of God's counselors? Or who hath first given to him? This is one of those verses that caused the entire word of faith to begin to crumble in my life and in my heart and in my concepts. He says, or who has first given to him, and it should be repaid unto him again. Do you know the entire word of faith movement is preached, whether it's praise, money, worship, service, whatever it is, you're offering this to God so God will repay you. And Paul says that has never once happened. No wonder Paul got into such a euphoria. He preached himself happy. Why? Why such happiness, Paul? Why are you so euphoric? Why is the fact that nobody's ever given something to God, including their faith, and God had to repay them for it? Why are you so happy about this, Paul? What is it that you've got this whole world of Roman people who have learned nothing but Peter and James's message? Why is it you're so excited that you got to share this with these people? For of him, through him, and to him are all things, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. And that is the completion of the teaching of Romans chapter 1 through chapter 11. You know, sometimes it's very difficult to imagine why I'm here. It's difficult for me to imagine how I got here. I obviously know the story. But it's still so out of the reach of anything that I've ever done, ever thought, ever considered that I might possibly be doing or would do or should do or could do. A man with severe social panic disorder does not go around trying to find places to go speak. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that God chose me for this. I refuse that. I refuse that as much as I refuse that it's by my faith that I've been redeemed. But am I grateful that I get to share this message? There is no way that I could possibly tell you how grateful I am. That such magnificent words, such magnificent understanding, such clarity, such freedom to breathe and think. Isn't it amazing once you hear the gospel? It's just like you can take the biggest, deepest breath you've ever had in your life. You can suddenly, your mind is free to think, to conceive as to the possibilities about life and your life and what the possibility is in front of you. People that come to understand the gospel are not paralyzed by the fears that hold them back. They're paralyzed by the possibilities that are in front of them. They're so vast. They're so plentiful. They're so amazing. Don't ever close your heart or mind to the possibilities of what the future could hold for you. Because if it can be a dream, it has a possibility of happening. Don't let anybody rob you. Only you understand what you want out of this life. Nobody else knows what you want out of this life. Nobody else knows what makes you content. Nobody else on this planet knows what causes you to be able to find your greatest sense of value and worth in what you are doing. Nobody can decide that for you. Nobody can dictate that to you. Women have suffered under Christian doctrine worse than men could ever think. Guys, as much as we think that we've had it bad, the ladies in here and the women around this world have suffered under Christian doctrine and every other religion around the world. Christianity has treated them as second-rate, half-rate, not capable of preaching, teaching, having to live with a husband they have to obey. Paul gets such a bad rap where women are concerned. When the first person that I know of in the history of the planet that ever stood up and said there is now, therefore now, no difference between male or female. Yet Paul gets the bad rap for being against women. Yet he was the first one to declare equality between. Very first one. I love spending my time here with you guys. Thank you so much. We're going to see if you have any questions. Maybe you've got some answers. Yes, Neil.
Blessed assurance.
Blessed assurance. Take off. Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. Oh, what a foretaste of glory divine. What are you? Heir of salvation. What else? Purchase of God. What else? Born of His Spirit, washed in His blood. Whose story is that? This is my story. This is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. This is my story. is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. I've often said Jesus didn't do this for you personally, but boy, don't we take it personally.
Yeah.
It's hard not to. But
Did Paul write the rest of the book?
did Paul write the rest of the book? That's a really good question. I have my questions about it. The one thing that we know about all of Paul's letters is that there was an attempt to alter Paul's teachings by add-ons by writers hundreds of years later, trying to copy the style, make it look like Paul, say it was Paul. I can tell you, the only thing I can tell you for sure is this teaching on this subject ends at the end of chapter 11. You can tell it ends by the close. I mean, isn't that a close of a letter? I mean, why would you say such a thing and then say, oh yeah, and then this too? How anticlimactic could something be? Personally, the 6 chapters that follow, I have great doubts that Paul wrote those. I think the book of Ephesians, I think Paul wrote the first 3 chapters of Ephesians. I think 4, 5, and 6 was written by somebody else. Scholars really know that Paul's letters were tampered with. Do you see why they would have been tampered with? They may not because of the way they were written to go in. You see, nowadays we can go in and we can cut and paste and put in the middle. But see, the only thing they could do is add on to the front or the back. And when you see such a drastic change take place in the last few chapters or chapter or whatever, you really can suspect that there is a possibility of someone's tampering with this, such as 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy, the first chapter of 1 Timothy is just really Paul all the way. And then it goes into writings of stuff that it just sounds like it totally disagrees with what Paul said in the first couple of chapters of Timothy. Do I know that for a fact? I don't know it for a fact. But I do know that we have a body of work from the Apostle Paul that lets us know this magnificent gospel. And if it's not there in the rest of the letter, I just leave it alone. I openly have done that. I can tell you that there is no more teaching on this subject in those last 6 chapters. Did Paul write an addendum to it? I don't know. Maybe he did. But there are contradictory statements in these last 6 chapters of the book of Romans that sure don't look like it was Paul. There's some places it's like, yeah, that kind of sounds like Paul. And then it's, yeah, well, that just can't be Paul because this disagrees directly with what he said in chapter 5 and chapter 6. You can pick those things out. It's amazing that we have to deal with such tampered with evidence. But at least we know the evidence was tampered with. So we can watch out for it. We can be aware. Now, like I said, there are people that are scholars in linguistics that go in and they see the cadence, they see the words that are used, the words, and they can tell you they can show you exactly where somebody stops writing one thing and somebody else tries, well, even if though they try very hard to mimic it. It's like a thumbprint, it's like a fingerprint. It just doesn't match up. And now I am not a trained person in this type of forensics to see whether or not the rest of the book of Romans is or is not written by Paul. I can give you a personal opinion. I don't think it was. If it was, I don't find anything in there that can possibly detract away from this marvelous teaching in chapter 1 through chapter 11. Who else?
So was there 3 or 4 different factions back then? Paulism, Peterism, Jamesism? Or was it?
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right. It seems as though that, and Vic was talking to me about this just about 3 weeks ago. It seems as though that Paul and Peter and John kind of started out on the same page, or at least close to it. The influence over Paul and over Peter is very clear that James tried to influence them toward the law. Sacrifices, he told Paul he had to go in and not only go through this animal sacrifices 25 years after the cross, and James is advocating that Paul go offer animal sacrifices in the temple, and not only to offer those animal sacrifices, but to go with 4 other people that they already had. So this wasn't done just for Paul. People say, oh, well, now they just did this for Paul, just with Paul, so that Paul could try to prove to the Jews, and Paul was becoming all that. Folks, they already had 4 people who were getting ready to go through this rite. And James not only ordered Paul to go through with it, he ordered him to pay for the other 4 guys. Now, if you cannot see the contention, of being ordered not only to go through a spiritual rite or a animal sacrifice, a rite of cleansing, and know that Paul, number one, would have had no part of it by his own volition, but to not see the fact that he was commanded by James to pay for the other guys, there was problems here. There really was problems. The thing that we see, if Paul was able to pay for his own sacrifices and the sacrifices of 4 other people, he was a wealthy man. He had money. Guess who James didn't like? He didn't like people with money. It's impossible to read the book of James and not see this man did not like people that had money. It is said that he was a part of a sect of the Ebionites. They were a group that had a vow of poverty. If you wonder how that kind of got into religion and the Catholic Church and everything, it pretty well comes from the Ebionites, which James was. And now the Ebionites today, you can't prove that absolutely, but the Ebionites today claim him as the founder of their religion, as he's the head of the Ebionites. He is honored or dishonored with that title, whichever one you might think it to be. So the clarity, when you try to crawl back into history and you try to stand in their shoes, it really does, it did something to me. As I began to stand there, and I've tried my best to stand in Paul's place when he was being instructed by James to go and do this sacrifice. Now, the one thing that we know, they tried to kill Paul. They caught him in the temple, and they drug him out of the temple, and it was Jews that were from Asia that had followed Paul. They had been kind of dogging his tracks. James knew this. James knew exactly what was going on. He was the head by whatever means. You will not find anything in the Bible that says why James, by the scriptures or by the New Testament, why James wound up being the head of the church in Jerusalem. There is nothing there. But become the head of it, he did. Ruling with such authority that even Paul himself submitted to it, to doing something that would have been completely against everything that was in Paul's consciousness about sacrifices and about anything to do with the law whatsoever. Then you have Peter, of course, who was influenced greatly by James. Says he was influenced by James. Paul called him out on it. And Jesus himself had told Peter that the Gentiles had all been cleansed. So Peter evidently started, as Paul told in the book of Galatians, he said, you used to go and eat with the Gentiles. Now you see, that would have been a new thing for Peter. Peter would not have been eating with the Gentiles unless something drastic had happened to him, such as Jesus appearing to him and saying, don't call unclean what I have cleansed. Now, first off, we know that Peter was willing to disobey Jesus for his religious convictions. Remember how many times he said, no, I'm not doing it, Jesus. Rise, kill, and eat. No, no, no. So we know by character that Peter was willing to disobey the risen Christ rather than to do what he said because of the oppression. And let me just say what I see. Because of the terrorism of James. I believe as much as Paul terrorized the early church, I believe that James terrorized anybody who dared to preach freedom and anything that was against the law, eating with Gentiles, against circumcision, whatever it was, he was willing to terrorize them. It says that Peter was stricken with fear of James. Absolutely stricken with fear of James. Now, here's the man who walked on water. This incredible thing going on with him and Jesus. He knew Jesus personally. And yet here James was able to strike fear in his heart about following through with what Jesus told him to do, that he ceased to eat with Gentiles anymore. And Paul rebuked him and said that you, Peter, and James are not walking uprightly according to truth. Now, the ramifications of such a harsh indictment against them is real. Do you think those guys forgot about that? Do you think that he withstood Peter to the face, told him that this man named James and John, that you used to eat with the Gentiles until the guys in Jerusalem, and he named them by name, that when men was sent from them, that's when you stopped eating with Gentiles. It says that when Paul saw that they walked not uprightly according to the truth, he rebuked Peter before them all. Where was James? The best we can tell, James never once left Jerusalem after he took over the authority in Jerusalem. There's no historical record that he ever left Jerusalem. There's no biblical record that he ever walked out of Jerusalem one single time. When it came time for his death, to get rid of him, they had to throw him from the roof of the temple. That's how closely attached to seat of authority and power that he was, that he died there. Now, it's said that the reason that they threw him from the temple is that he would not say that Jesus Christ was not the Lord. We don't know if that story is correct or not. This is some historical account that is extra biblical, and we do have historical accounts. We have no account of really what happened to the other disciples. You know, there was 12 disciples, folks. Do you realize the rest of them aren't even mentioned? Peter, James, and John, and that's it. But there was a mass exodus that took place out of Jerusalem when Paul was breathing out his threatenings. You've got to understand that Paul's conversion, these people had left town because of Paul's terrorism. And now all of a sudden, they've got a new terrorist in town. He is governing what people believe and can't believe based on Judaistic law. He is imposing it on Gentiles. It's just the facts. And that part we find right in here. This is not something that's hidden. It's just right there. You say, well, why haven't we ever seen this before? Because we were told it wasn't there. We were told it wasn't there. There's no disagreement in here. These guys all agreed with each other. So what happened to your brain when you read across it? You went skiing. Just right on the top of it. You didn't even see it. How interesting. And you went on. But you see, we've slowed down. You know, we got off the skis and started on a nice hike up the mountain. And we've started seeing things a little bit more than skiing across the surface of this. But I'm telling you, the history of this is very much here. There's other historians that existed back in that time. There's a lot of people that agree with him, a lot of people that disagree with him. But the fact that James held this position of power is recorded in history and also in the Bible. That's just all there was to it. I see no reason for someone to refuse to leave the seat of his power other than fear that he would lose his power if he left the place. Why else would you confine yourself like a prisoner and never leave the town, never leave the temple, stay there during the entire time? There was something about it that James wanted this power. He claimed the power, and for some reason, Paul and the disciples, Peter and John, and the rest of the disciples, man, they just left town. They just didn't want any part of it. Whether it was, and so when you start reading what James had to say to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, you know what he says there. If you look at those Greek words, he's talking to the poor Jews that are scattered abroad. It is very clear that he's talking to poor Jews, not just Jews, but to the poor Jews. So who's he writing to? He's writing to his own sect. Why did this sect leave town? They left because of Paul. There's just no other reason for the scattering other than Paul's breathing out his threatenings. Did James have a willing audience about his statements that he wanted to have Paul? Did he have to say the name of Paul for these people to know who the hell he was talking about? Isn't it rich people that oppress you and take you before the Sanhedrin? Well, just how many of those was there around? There's only one recorded in the New Testament, and that was Paul. Every chance in the book of James. I tell you what, if you read the book of James and just allow yourself to think he might have been talking about Paul, it's going to jump out at you as clear as day. This man did not like people that had money. James believed that while he was living in the opulence of the temple, he taught that poverty was righteousness. James taught that wealth is unrighteousness. How the Word of Faith movement can quote anything out of the book of James, I don't know how they do it. Because James totally believed if you got money, you're ungodly. It's what he taught, it's what he believed, it's what he lived, except for the opulence of the temple he occupied. Any other questions?
I've got two. First one is just kind of quick and curious, but I know there was a group or faction, it's called The Way, or they were followers of The Way, and I was just kind of curious who they would have been and how they would have, like in regards to all of this that was going on, kind of in this whole big picture of the poem.
The best we understand is this is what the group was called before the term Christian was attached.
Okay.
All right? It was called the people of the way, at first. But now you see the people of the way, just the same as the term Christian, was ascribed by other people. They didn't say, oh, we are people of the way. It was unbelievers that called them people of the way. It was other people that called them, that made the statements to them that that's those Christians, which has become a curse word, folks. So here we are trying to figure out what is a Christian. Well, if we're all Christians, what is a Christian? So you look up the word and it says to be Christ-like. So then what do? We teach the entire church is full of people to be Christ-like. WWJD.
No. Who wants Jack Daniels?
Who wants Jack Daniels? WWJD.
I like it.
I like it too. But We do know that Christianity was Christian was not a name that Jesus called them. Jesus never called people to be Christians. Paul never called people to be Christians. He never even called them to become people of the way. None of that ever took place out of Paul's mouth. The term Christian is used by only one of the New Testament writers, where I believe it's Peter who says, "But if any man suffer as a Christian, that's all right. You shouldn't go around suffering, but if you suffer as a Christian, that's an acceptable type of suffering if you're suffering for being Christian." Now, we don't know that that's just the name that he finally accepted, that this is what they call us. But there is nothing biblical, there is nothing scriptural about why people began to be called Christians or should be called Christians today. We know that the definition of the word has led people into a lot of very deep bondage, for sure, trying to be Christ-like.
So the second question I had was kind of bigger picture. The power of Christianity seems to be control, structure, manipulation, and the ability to channel people's thinking and get them to do what they do, and to kind of step in line. And that has also seemed to lead to their success in being able to control the masses and have such influence over the way we think. How do you think the gospel can combat that? What about the gospel can pull out the rug from underneath that whole thing? And how do you see, what strengths is it that the gospel has that can overcome that?
The only thing we have to rely on, Owen, is people like this, because they're not a part of Christianity. Now, you've got to realize, I never told anyone in this room to stop being a Christian. I never told anybody in this room to stop going to church. Is that a true statement, guys?
That's a true
I've
statement.
never given you an instruction to stop doing, stop going, stop doing, stop anything. I've never told you to stop anything. We just simply shared the gospel with them. Now, what has happened to them, I think, is the pattern of what you're asking. The only thing that we have, the gospel is the power of God. Why would we want to use some other force, So the issue is just simply getting it to the ears of the people that need to hear it. Thus, walk-in Owen. And everybody else who does. Thus, walk-in Wade Brewer, who goes into mosque in every place that he can go. I mean, if he's painting a house and somebody's painting with him, he's going to know the gospel by the time the house is painted. It's just Wade Brewer. That's all there is to it. Now, let me tell you, with me, people that are around me on a daily basis, now Owen knows this. Owen's around me every day. We go to the gym, and Owen knows nobody around me knows what I do whatsoever. Well, Mike, shouldn't you be? I don't go with shouldn't you be and all of that. Now, if Wade ever needs any money to keep doing what he's doing, I'll send him a check to help him do it. I ain't doing it. Why? I don't want to do it. This is what I like to do. This is what I want to do, and this is how I do it. I do not tell people that I very rarely tell somebody I'm in the ministry. Owen can tell you himself, he had to drag it out of me what I do. After 6 or 7 times into the restaurant, he just pinned me down. And he said, Mike, tell me what you do. And I know he noticed the hesitance. And I said, okay, I'll give you the 2-minute Reader's Digest version. Because all I want to do is get on the other side of it, forget it, and let's keep going. I'm not out to convert people. And I gave him the 2-minute Reader's Digest version, and I hadn't been able to get rid of him since. So, and I'm glad I'm not able to get rid of him also. But folks, you got to follow your own heart. This is not a prescription for how we do this. You follow your heart. If you want to share with people, if you want to go and sit down and talk to pastors, if you want to do this on the job, if you don't want to do it on the job, you see, that's the wonderful thing about the gospel. We don't have any instructions for you whatsoever. We don't have any. This is not how you do it, when you do it, where you do it. We just don't have any of those instructions. Am I right by doing that? It's not an issue of whether I'm right or wrong. It's just me. I have found power in just knowing the gospel truth. It has, oh my gosh. I don't ever want somebody to connect doing something with being who they are. Once you get your being down and you know there is nothing that challenges your being, whether you do or don't do, whatever it is, then decide what you want to do. Many of you here, your number one way of supporting the gospel and making sure the gospel gets out is that you give us money when we come up here. And we really do appreciate that. Also, I've been needing to tell you, if anybody wants to help out Moses and his family in Kenya, please designate that to Vic. These guys still have the schools of the scriptures going over there. They've been through some really hard times. I am so sorry that I did not bring that up earlier. But if any at all, anything that you would decide, if you want to give them $25 or $50, $100 or $10,000, it's fine with me. But they definitely could use the help. They are doing a lot to spread the gospel in the middle of great hardship. That is for sure. Satisfy you?
I'm satisfied.
All right. Who else? Anybody got just a comment? This is it.
I like what you said about being. You know, there's that saying, like, who you are speaks louder than what you say.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's who we are that is the light.
Oh, I think so.
So much more than our words, really. Although words are necessary too, but.
Yes. Yeah, you know, my brother, it's been difficult. We've had a strained relationship, possibly just perception on my part. I don't know. He's been a Baptist ever since he came to the Lord when he was standing in a hospital room and I had just attempted suicide. And I came to, and I was just a kid. And I came to, and Gary just swore I'd never known him to be in a church. He never went to church. And so I came to, I've been told all this because I don't remember these things. I was unconscious for 3 days from a suicide overdose. And, but I came to, Gary came in the room, and I came to in the moment he was there, and I looked up at him, I reached my hand out to him, and he took my hand, and I said, Gary, please pray for me. And that's all I said. Now, my family told me that he slid down the wall, really unable to stand. And he told his wife they needed to leave. He went home. I think this was on a Saturday they were there. He said, tomorrow morning we're going to church. And before the pastor could give the altar call, he was up running toward the front. My brother's a good man. He wanted to help me more than anything. And he has been a dedicated, committed person to his Christianity. You will not find a better human being, honestly. He is just a wonderful man. He's 77 years old. He's 11 years older than I, and then there's 4 sisters in between us, and all crazy as they can be. They're my sisters. How else could they be anything else? But Gary's just a very solid, dependable, stable man. Worked at Y12 there in Oak Ridge at the atomic energy place. He retired from working at Y12. And I've always been proud of my brother. You know, my brother, I was really stupid in school, you know. And my brother took calculus and trigonometry and all this stuff, and he's a basketball player, and he was a golfer, and he wore classy clothes with pleats down the front, you know, and they just buzzed my hair off and put me in a pair of jeans, you know. And that's my story. That's the way I remember it. I'm sure others have a different story. But recently, Gary has been watching our Tuesday night Bible studies. Blew me away. I went up to see my sister, and who's not been feeling well, and her husband died. I went up just a month or so ago, month and a half or so ago, and my brother was just, it was amazing. I just could not believe what was happening. And then after that's when he told me that he had been watching these Tuesday night Bible studies. Folks, if you're not watching that, you are missing something. This is 15 minutes of power-packed. I mean, I played the song for you. Now you know why we're so jazzed up when we come online. We play Uptown Funk, and we play that right before we go on the air. And sometimes we barely get it turned off before we go live. So if you hear the tail end of Uptown Funk, you'll know what's going on. But my brother brought up the conversation when I was up the last time. And then he wanted to talk to me again about it on the phone. And I told him, I'm trying to be gracious and say this to where that he'll keep listening, and I'm so glad that he's listening. I want him to have all the truth he can have. If he's happy where he is, then I want him to stay there. I don't want to try to change my brother. He's a wonderful man. And so I was telling him, I said, Gary, I said, I don't know for sure that what I'm teaching is absolute truth or not. I said, I'm really just trying to follow my heart, and I've seen people really helped by this, but I said history and other people will have to judge my work for what I've done, and they'll have to decide whether or not what I've done has been a good thing or not. And he said, I can tell you one thing, it's been good for you. So here, to address your point, I'm sorry to tell such a long story, to get to a single little point. I didn't have to tell my brother anything. And he said, Mike, he says, when you were up here, said the whole family was talking about it. They said, we see that you have the peace that we all hoped that you might have someday. I mean, they went through 3 attempts of suicide with me. They never knew when the phone was going to ring and I was going to be dead. So this is what my relationship to my family was early on. And, we'd lost our mother when I was 14 years old, so everybody was traumatized by that. And then they went right into me, every whip stitch, taking an overdose. And and I joined churches. I'd be baptized again. I got baptized again. After I got my brother to go to church, I went to his church and got saved in his church. And then I got baptized in his church. And I remember my brother, he got so tickled because the pastor was trying to figure out how the hell to baptize me, with me being as tall as I am, and he was kind of a little guy. And when he took me, it was one of those Baptist churches with, the window and the baptistries up behind the choir. And when he tried to get me, he told me, he whispered to me, he says, Mike says, when I get ready to take you down, squat down. Because he was trying to figure out how to do this. And even after I squatted down, he dunked me and knocked my head into the concrete on the edge of that. So I really almost died with Christ right there, going under the water. And I remember my brother getting so tickled. He's got a very distinctive laugh, and I could just hear him chuckling out there. He just got so tickled that the pastor just about knocked me out trying to baptize me. So you just don't know where life's going to go. I thought that I'd lost I thought that I had lost my family forever. And it's just something that I had to live with. So the possibility, even a possibility, is just so amazing to me. At the same time, you got to protect your heart a little bit, because you can't just open up totally, because, they could walk right out of your life again, just like it seemed like before. Just let people see what the gospel is. Let them see what it is. They don't have to hear what it is. Let's let them see what it is. Any other comments? Anything anybody wants to say?
What is your response to the people that have known you for so many decades? Like, are you a Christian? Like, they want to know, they want to
if they ask me directly, I tell them that I do not espouse to Christianity. But I right behind that, I let them know. I said I have a very strong persuasion about Christ and what He did, and I just don't think Christianity is a good representative. Now, usually when I say that, people are very open to that. Most people are really kind of burnt out on Christianity, even if they're still going. But you got to say it in a way to where that they can hear it. You got to make sure that they know that you're respect and you're convinced of who Jesus is, but you just think that Christianity is not representing the gospel in a way. And I said, so I kind of left Christianity, but it has nothing to do with leaving Christ. I said I'm still completely all in for Jesus.
Do you ever use the term like I'm a redemptionist?
No.
No.
I'm giving them a term they are unfamiliar, they would not be familiar with. Now, we that term redemptionist that is a word that is created by Mike Williams Ministries and the Gospel Revolution. We were talking about, people are going to label us, so why don't we come up with a term that labels ourselves? We are not universalists, so what do we call ourselves? So I think it was Jeff Robertson actually we were sifting through words and how to say this and everything, and Jeff, I think it was, found that there was no claim to the word redemptionist or redemptionism, and so we thought, hey, we'll claim it. That kind of sounds like what we do. So down through the ages, if somebody is Googling redemptionism, redemptionist, it's going to have one definition, and we have put the definition as to what a redemptionist is and what they believe, or what we believe. So, and we had folks that got upset that we added an ism to it. Oh, isms or schisms, and I don't know why you had to do this. Why didn't we just stay free from all that? Well, we're just trying to reach out every way we can, We don't have a way to do it and a way not to do it. We just try everything we can. We'll throw the spaghetti at the refrigerator and see if it sticks, So, anyone else? Thank you guys for this time. Owen, you got anything you want to say to the folks as you get ready to leave?
Can't express how grateful I am to receive such a warm welcome from all of you. It's been an amazing, impactful weekend, and I think I was telling Jack that look forward to hopefully coming back if you guys don't kick me out.
Bring your shoes.
Jury's out.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Awesome. Thanks. Yes, Wayne.
I just got one little thing I'd like to say I experienced yesterday when I was talking to a young Muslim gentleman that's here born in Iran, I think. And he's a brilliant kid, probably 28. He's got PhDs and doctorates in chemical science and in the petroleum industry, so he's here to further his education. So I'm not talking to a guy who doesn't know his stuff.
Yeah.
Very well studied. But I noticed he had a little booklet on the desk, and I said, what's the little booklet about? And he said, well, these are little citations, little recitations put together for Muslims. And I said, so you're a Muslim? And I said, well, what's in the book? And he said, well, when you sneeze, there's a little something